Hey, quick thing before we get into this. If you're an independent artist feeling stuck, scattered, or just tired of figuring it all out alone, I've made something for you. It's called the Artist Mind Map 2.0. And yeah, it's been 5 years in the making. Built through real work with artists all around the world, from cities like Nashville, Tenerife, Mumbai, New York, Berlin. Real-life people, musicians and artists just like you I've worked with. So not just theory, but lived stuff. And I've rebuilt this into a 6-day clarity sequence, a mini course. Each day gives you one simple prompt or tool, not fluff, just stuff that helps you finally move, focus, and remember who the heck you are. I'm building a community of holistic, happy creatives, musicians and artists who are building their careers on their own terms without selling out, without burning out. And contrary to what the industry says, this might actually be one of the best times in history to be an artist, but only if you know how to navigate what the real work is. So if this is something you're interested in, you can grab it free at holisticmusicianacademy.com. Just go to holisticmusicianacademy.com and click on free training. holisticmusicianacademy.com, free training. When art is the place we flee to, the refuge becomes real. But no refuge is meant to be home, a true home. When it becomes all we lean upon, that safety net turns into a trap, reminiscent of what we thought we were escaping from in the first place. Trauma bonding in the creative life is a subtle but very real danger. Human beings are wired for connection, and I'd argue that artists perhaps feel that wiring more acutely. The patterns in our artistic practice, the relationships we form within our peer ecosystems are expressions of the same need. But when the search for meaning and belonging arises from survival mechanisms, the shadow side to connection, the heartbeat of creativity, can bind us to pain. Unprocessed trauma can distort the mind into mistaking familiar feelings, even if painful, for safety, and survival for intimacy. Let's unpack. Welcome to another session solo cast. These solo casts were designed to help independent artists and musicians like you navigate the very complex labyrinth that is your artistic practice and career. They're based on empirical research and experiences of my own career as an independent musician and an educator and coach working with artists just like you. The primary aim behind these sessions is to offer accessibility to the kind of education many of us need to work with in order to forward ourselves in these very confusing times as empowered and independent artists in the truest sense of the word. What is trauma bonding? Now, this is a sensitive topic, so I'm going to try and outline the concept with as much precision as I can. Trauma bonding, sometimes called traumatic bonding in literature, refers to a strong emotional attachment that persists in relational contexts marked by trauma, imbalance, and conditioned connection. For instance, a study of 354 people in abusive relationships found that childhood maltreatment and attachment insecurity, very adult-sounding terms there, were possible predictors of trauma bonding. And trauma bonding in turn was associated with higher levels of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. This is verified literature, by the way. A classic empirical investigation showed that variables like intermittency of maltreatment, which is alternating harm and relief, and power differentials, power dynamics which fluctuate, explained over 50% of the variance in attachment to an abusive partner 6 months after separation. Also verified literature. Now, for those of you interested, I have a separate article on intermittent reinforcement on the blog. There'll be a link included. Some key features in trauma bonding include repeated exposure to trauma or threat, not just a one-off event, so a pattern. Relational or structural power imbalance, wherein one party is more vulnerable than the other. Attachment dynamics. The vulnerable person remains bonded to the relationship, the role, the identity. And conditioning. The cycle of pain, relief, pain, which gives paradoxical comfort and familiarity, believe it or not. A note here, it is crucial to emphasize that the term is rooted in research primarily based on abusive relationships, somewhat extreme, even traffic, coercive control. So it doesn't literally translate to creative lives in the way many of us might think, but the structural logic here offers a potent metaphor for what many artists live without naming it. And that's what I'm going to try and change with this episode today. So, clinical research shows that trauma bonding is not mythical, but measurable. It arises in context of repeated trauma, power or relational imbalance, attachment insecurity, as aforementioned, and shapes how one remains linked long after safety would suggest detaching from these patterns. When you're an artist who stumbled into your medium because everything else had collapsed, you might have built an entire relational world, collaborators, mentors, audiences, around that broken ground foundation, which is not really a foundation, without necessarily realizing it. So the biggest danger here is not the trauma that was experienced itself, not in the present moment anyway, because we are talking about trauma from the past. But in an everyday present situation, the real danger is when it becomes a foundation for the artistic practice, the cause, the currency, and eventually morphs into an identity. When familiar pain feels like belonging. I was reminded of this at an informal party once, listening to two colleagues spiral from what started off as innocent banter into a shared rant about peers they both knew and situations they'd found themselves in as a result. The mood in the room shifted, and what began as harmless venting, if such a thing exists, turned into a kind of emotional alliance built on grievance. Ironically, since, and I hope this is okay to mention, since I'm not naming any names, they've since joined forces. It's a partnership of sorts on multiple levels, born more of shared wounds rather than shared vision for expansion. And it made me realize how easily artists can often mistake familiarity in pain for genuine connection, and how such bonds, while comforting, rarely lead to a true creative or even emotional sustainability. Conversations like these quickly become a feedback loop for bitterness. A narrative like, "They never understood us. That scene is toxic. People like us never get opportunities." And so what looks like solidarity on the surface is actually a shared trauma narrative. It creates temporary intimacy, the relief of being quote-unquote understood. But the emotional charge keeps them anchored in grievance rather than true evolution. And over time, this kind of bond can reinforce victimhood and mistrust, often disguised as insight or realism. Why artists often slip into this pattern? Here's the thing. If you live by creativity, you're already working on the edge of inner worlds. That's some deep work you're involved in by default. Add to that, you entered art during a time of personal crisis, which is often the case, and this is the story your brain might start telling you. You were wounded, art saved you. In reality, though, your brain just carved new neural pathways, wiring that temporary relief from your art and creation of the same into the same circuit. So every time now you picked up an instrument, a brush or your pen, it wasn't always about art. It was the nervous system rehearsing safety, or what it thought of as safety. Here are some common pathways. Art as refuge. I made a loose mention to this earlier on. Many artists begin their creative journey not in celebration but in crisis. When life fractures, art becomes a sanctuary, and in itself that can be a beautiful thing. The brain rewiring safety through sound, color, or motion, that's a healing process. But what starts as expression becomes survival, binding trauma and craft into one fragile, necessary rhythm. Another example would be wounded identity as creative currency. The industry, peer group, even the audience often valorizes authentic suffering. The quote-unquote struggling artist is part myth, part reality. When you identify as the one who made it despite, the wound becomes part of your brand. And that is such a slippery slope to be part of. Relational ecosystem grounded in damage. You build peers and collaborators who, quote-unquote, get you because of your pain. The connection is, we have scars. Yeah, as a general statement. The side effect? You may sideline relationships rooted in hope, play, growth, true growth, than crisis, because those might feel less familiar to you. And generally speaking, what this results in, all of these, is a form of resistance to true healing. If the wound defines your art, your worth, your bonds, then healing feels like betraying the identity. And yet unresolved trauma continues to sap your creative force. A recent study emphasizes how attachment insecurity interacts with early trauma to actually strengthen trauma bonds. This is verified research, folks. It's not just an opinion. And artists are particularly susceptible to these stories, not because we're weaker, mind you, but because we're often deeper in the manner in which we navigate our emotions. We are attracted to authenticity, raw nerve, and that's a gift. But when it's the only signal in your life, in your artistic practice, it's a loop you risk remaining stuck in. A few anecdotes from my own story, which was from refuge to reckoning. I came into the music world, or my musical world, in the middle of a storm. Extreme health issues, domestic unrest, mental health edges. The music said, you're here, you can still exist. So I built everything, practice habits, friendships, identity, around being the one who survived. And the refuge was real. But the safety net became the house I started living in. It worked for a while. At least I figured out soon enough what I wanted to do as my vocation, as my profession. But as I fathered my education, during my conservatory years, for example, at some point the body and mind rebelled again. It started off with tendinitis, where I couldn't play for months. My technique faded, my purpose wavered. The force of that reckoning The question that it brought wasn't just, how do I keep going anymore? But why do I go at all? It was my first stark confrontation with why I even became an artist. And over the years, I had to rebuild not just the practice, but my entire stance on this topic. And I got to be honest, I say this from a space of caring and love for you listening, hoping you won't repeat these mistakes. I watched peers who never made that transition. It didn't end well. They stayed in the cycle. Stage fright, I'm not good enough. The wounded role. In some cases, the narrative even served them, temporarily, professionally, but eventually tethered them. And before they realized it, it had enmeshed itself as an inherent part of their persona, and eventually their entire life. So, to clarify though, I too have totally been guilty of it, leaning on the story of my pain as if it gave me permission to keep struggling all my life. And I'll tell you this from experience, the hardest question to ask when we're in the thick of these stories is this: am I addicted to my own trauma because it defines me and gives me something to lean on? Or is even lucrative? Ouch. And phew. Exactly. What the pattern looks like in creative lives is this. When the artist trauma bond dynamics are in play, you might observe signs like your creative identity says, because I suffered, I have something to say. And then you resist doing the work unless the pain is live. And then you keep recycling the same wound in your work, not to evolve it, but because it reliably connects you to that part of your heart. Even, a heartbreak is often one of the easiest ways to actually connect to our heart. It can be a source for creativity that we can find reliable, comfortable. Your relationships, creative or personal, default to late-night vulnerability, shared breakdowns, melodrama, mutual survival, mutual pain, rather than shared, expansive, happy growth, play, trust, hope, the inherent belief in goodness, benevolence. You might fear that if you feel well, you'll lose legitimacy as an artist. Sound familiar? The idea of flourishing freaks you out. Well, it freaked me out at some point, way back in the day. I'll own it. Sometimes we even feel guilt or suspicion when we feel joy in our art, as if you're betraying the real origin of your voice. Sound familiar? I'd bet $1 million it does, at least to 9 out of 10 people listening to this right now. And the overall result of all of this, you avoid healing. Or you only heal in secret. Because the visible stuff must remain the one who suffers and creates. To be fair, these are not the only examples out there. I'm happy and proud to say that I have found a circle of co-creators who've taken it upon themselves to change that narrative. That's a different story. I'm coming to that in a bit. We're still talking about trauma bonding and its risks. Yeah. Why this matters? Why this matters is it basically boils down to the cost we pay for staying stuck. When you build your artistic life around that loop of trauma, the costs are real. You risk stagnation because your art may never expand beyond the wound's orbit. You risk relational rigidity. Your network may lock you into the survival mode rather than the thriving mode. You risk identity foreclosure. The wounded artist becomes the only self you recognize. You risk missed potential. Trauma drains creativity if unprocessed. A recent review highlights that trauma and bonding issues impede healthy attachment and growth. And down the line, you keep reinforcing the loop. Because once conditioning takes effect, the cycle of harm and relief becomes familiarity. Behavioral science shows how conditioned attachment operates in these contexts. So, in creative fields, needless to say, we will tend to glorify the struggle. But what if the struggle mode is an outdated version of yourself? What do you do then? What happens when you're ready to reinvent yourself, when you're sick of being sad? What if there's still craft, still play, still freedom to harvest, true freedom? What if you want to be fucking happy? What happens then? That's when we start turning the page and shifting into a healthier creative posture. And to make sure that I leave you with something that can help you do that, here are some practices and mind shifts that can pull you out of the loop while honoring the wound, not erasing it. You ready? Let's go. 1. Recognize the wound's role and its limit. Say, yes, I came from that place of brokenness. It shaped me, but it doesn't define me forever. 2. Reorient your practice. Move from I create because I suffer to I create because I want to explore. Practice because you're alive, not because you survived. 3. Expand your relational base. Invite collaborators, mentors, peers. Get coached. Find people who don't just share the wound, but share curiosity, growth, possibility. Let friendship be not just quote-unquote we survived, but we play together. Yes, we see your pain, we understand it, we hold space for it, we show compassion, but we don't stay there, we don't hang out there. We move on. We use that to remind us of how powerful we are to have been still standing after all the shit we went through. And we use that as evidence for the incredibly powerful beings we are, and move on. 4, bring light as well as dark. Let your art reflect both sides, the wound and the healing. Let joy, experimentation, risk beyond the safe storm zone. The shadow had its role. Let the light also have its turn. 5, rewrite your identity. I'm an artist who was wounded, who is healing, who continues to grow. The story becomes, I'm not just the one who survived. I'm the one who's still alive and kicking, man. And I want to help others do the same in whatever capacity I can. 6, embed healing into the creative ecosystem. Therapy, rest, coaching, boundaries, body care, exercise, gym work, yoga. These are not distractions from your art, trust me. If you want to keep doing this for the rest of your life, they are not just a part of your ecosystem, of your artistic practice, they're the foundation. Because when you heal the people around you, your work deepens to whole new degrees rather than lose the urgency you might be worried about losing. And last but not least, allow the next chapter. There is so much goodness waiting to happen in your life if you allow it. The wound was chapter 1. It was just the beginning. And I'm so proud of you to have been there. But let your next chapter be about something else. Let it be about the craft, about your highest potential, curiosity, connection, love. The wound gave you entry. Now you build from beyond that. How's that for inspiration? How's that for an identity? Final thought. Your art welcomed you when you were wounded. That welcome is sacred. That was the mother keeping you safe. But stay too long in the foyer of your trauma, and chances are you'll forget the main hall is waiting. Please don't mistake that refuge for the ultimate destination, for your home. The pattern of trauma bonding is not condemnation. It's a map. It reveals how deeply we get entangled when the wound becomes our ecosystem. But we are capable of shifting. We are capable of building from the wound, not inside the wound, not being the wound. We are capable of loving ourselves despite our scars and still choosing completely new colors. Art is not about surviving. It's about being alive, being human. And when your systems of identity, relationship, creativity are anchored in surviving alone, you risk missing being that alive human. So let the art carry not only your pain, but also your possibility, your true potential. Hope that helps. If this episode gave you something real, pass it on to another creative who needs it. This is how we move, soul first, together. You can subscribe, leave a quick review, or share it on your socials to support the show. And don't forget to grab your free Artist Mind Map 2.0 Clarity Reset at theholisticmusicianacademy.com. My name's TL. I'm an independent artist, coach, and founder of the Holistic Musician Academy. Thanks for listening.